Okay, computer says I'm live. So, yep, I'm live. And I wanted to say hi to everybody on this beautiful March day. It is time to break down some things and maybe have a breakdown over things. We'll have to see before we're done. We are going to break down the sermon from last Sunday, Daniel chapter 9. And we've been talking about prophecy for a while now, the last couple weeks. And we rolled up our sleeves and went at one of the key primary end times prophecies that a lot of end times doctrine is based on. And so I want to talk about that. And I want to answer any questions that you might have. As people are coming on here, feel free to chime in. I will do my best. The question I have today is, how deep should we go in our breakdown of Daniel chapter 9? And I think the point of these breakdowns is for me to just be as open and honest as possible in terms of what the pastor goes through. That's really the main point, is for me to break down my process, but also expand on the passage in ways that maybe we didn't have time for during the service and during the sermon, or maybe into things that are scholarly pursuits that may or may not be appropriate for a Sunday sermon, where we're trying to do soul care and soul motivation. And so maybe we'll do both today. To wit, let me start with my process. So Daniel 9 is one of those pivotal passages in Scripture that I think everyone should take a stab at. Everyone should study it, read it, try and figure it out. It's there for a reason, and we need to take it seriously. It's also one of those passages that is hotly debated in many Christian traditions. And I should mention this, I sit on the credentialing council for our district in the Evangelical Free Church, which means if somebody wants to be licensed or ordained, I get the invitation to be on the committee that interviews that person. And when it comes to end times doctrine, there are a couple positions that historically the Free Church has kind of planted its flag on. And only until recently they kind of took their flag out of. But it is an interesting conversation in those councils, because in the Free Church you can hold one of a number of positions, but you have to defend it. You have to be able to explain it biblically and scripturally. And so when I approach a passage like Daniel 9, I'm not intimidated by it in that sense of I'm scared to preach or study a passage. But I do find it extra challenging to preach because it is such a hotly debated passage. And in my experience, people who have a very particular end times view, and I'll just call it what it is, it's called dispensationalism, hold this passage out as being one of the key kind of Rosetta Stones for the end times doctrine, which is called eschatology, for that eschatological position. And I grew up with that position. I held a dispensational view of the end times for a large percentage of my life, mostly because I was part of the evangelical subculture where that's really what the option was. And again, the Free Church used to plant their flag they didn't say dispensational, they said premillennial, which we'll talk about today. But for most Free Churches, that meant dispensational. And so I grew up with that. And when I was a kid, we didn't have the Left Behind books, which, if you've read the Left Behind books or seen the movies or what have you, that is very much a dispensational position on the end times. For me, when I was a kid, it wasn't the Left Behind series. It was the Thief in the Night series. There were 4 movies that were made late 70s, early 80s that followed that dispensational breakdown of the end times. And they terrified me. I remember being in Sunday school and watching one of them that had a woman in prison who, he was a guy in prison, but wouldn't receive the mark of the beast. And so the camera shot was this person in prison through the barred window of the cell, and you could see the guillotine on the outside, and then cut to black, end of the movie. And I was like 8, maybe maybe 9 or 10 when I watched this, and it always stuck with me. And so this whole kind of end times fascination, which I've had again since I was a very small child, uh, about the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and the return of Christ and the war in the between the people of the enemy and the people of God, and I've been fascinated with it my whole life. All that to say, I am not a dispensationalist now, but I am totally supportive of those who are. In fact, sitting on that ordination council, I would say the bulk of people who come through for ordination licensing are. And it is not a primary issue in the free church any longer. And so I am happy and willing, if they can support it biblically, to approve them for their credentialing, even if I might disagree with them on eschatology. And that's kind of the posture I wanted to bring into all of this Daniel prophecy. Is there are multiple very well researched and well argued solutions to the puzzles of biblical prophecy. And as long as you're open-handed about it and willing to disagree agreeably, there's room for everybody at the table. What I will push back against is somebody who says, I'm right and everyone else is wrong, or even a heretic if you don't agree with me on this. And really, with any of those camps, you're going to find people who say that. But I have found in my experience, it tends to be dispensationalists who are the least, how do I want to say this in a nice way, least willing to entertain other people's perspectives. But maybe that's just because that's the journey I came from. And maybe your experience might be different. Your mileage might be different on that. So I'm not trying to speak for anyone but myself on this. But I've been accused of being a heretic by no longer being a dispensationalist by dispensationalists. So I'm trying to be as open as possible in my processes as we're heading into these biblical prophecies. I'm not trying to pick a fight, but I got to be honest with where I've come. And so that's kind of the backdrop. But let's talk about so as my process, as I'm going into Daniel and knowing we're not stopping after chapter 6, and we're actually going to dig into the deep end of prophecy, that I'm going to have to talk about this, and I'm going to have to lay my cards on the table like I just did. I didn't want to do that without doing my homework and doing the legwork and being as respectful and honest as possible. And so that's what I've been doing. A lot of the books I've read on Daniel, not just from the historical perspective, but trying to thread this needle of the varying positions on some of these prophetic passages. So it's funny. This is probably the first sermon I can remember. I'm sure it's not the first, but it's the first one I can remember, first one in a long time. I haven't had a single person, not one, talk to me about the sermon on Sunday. I had a couple people on Sunday morning talk about, oh, it's great, we're doing Daniel in our Sunday school class, and it's so nice that these are overlapping. Or, hey, that really helped me in what I'm going to teach in my class. Talk to Mark Adams about that, because it correlated with what he was going to be teaching in the second service hour class that he teaches. But not a single person came up and said that was really helpful, or I really disagreed. And I don't know if it's just because I was in different conversations and I wasn't available for people to come up and say that, or because I was expecting pushback and people to disagree with me and that didn't happen, or maybe people are afraid to. I don't know. But it is weird because this was the one in Daniel that has been ever present on my mind since we started the series. Is I'm going to have to get to Daniel 9 and I'm going to have to unpack this in a way that I think is fair to the text, but it might upset other people who have studied this and disagree with me. And so I tried to tread lightly, but also be bold at the same time. Always a difficult balance. I don't know if I did that effectively or ineffectively. I just know nobody said boo about it. So I'm not trying to fish for feedback now. I'm just saying that was interesting to me. And I'm not sure I know what to do with all that. However, here we are today. And so I'm going to talk more about it and see what happens. Generally, when it comes to the end times, I'm going to lay it out as broadly as possible. I will, because this is going out into the whole world and it says Daniel 9 right on the title. I'm sure somebody who has a very strong opinion will want to write comments about this later. And if you do, you're awesome. And I hope you do. I'm going to try and be as fair as possible to every position. But here are the general positions about the timing and the way that the end times will play out, very broadly. What I've mentioned already is this concept of dispensationalism. And this is the idea that the 70th week in Daniel 9 is a future stretch of 7 years that are going to be cut in half for some reason. And during those 7 years will be the Great Tribulation, where a little horn type that we've been seeing in Daniel 8 and 9 will rise up, will do great damage in the world, will cause a phenomenal amount of tribulation on the people. And at the end of that 7 years, we will be ushered into a time of millennium, which is from Revelation chapter 20, 1,000-year period that's literal. And in the dispensational view, that is the time when the promises made to Israel will be fulfilled, and that Israel will then become the focus again after the church age, which is the 69 weeks that we're in now. And again, I'm probably getting some of these details wrong, but that's generally the idea. And again, it's the Left Behind model. Now, there's a debate when the church will leave the earth during the tribulation. Will it be at the beginning? Will it be in the middle? Or will it be at the end? We will be reigning during the 1,000 years of a literal millennium with Christ. But the rapture idea is there either at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of the tribulation. But the dispensational idea is it is the time in that 70th week in the future for God to fulfill his promises to Israel. And a lot of it is based on this Daniel 9 counting. Now, that is the premillennial position with dispensationalism as a part of it. There's a second position called the historical premillennial position, which is, yes, in Revelation 20, it talks about a 1,000-year period, and that it is a literal 1,000-year period to come, but it isn't necessarily designated for Israel. And again, you can incorporate the 70th week idea of a 7-year tribulation with a 3.5-year mark somewhere. That connects also to some dates and counting in Revelation. But the historical premillennial position is that, yes, there is a literal millennium coming, and you can be pre-tribulation rapture, mid-tribulation rapture, post-tribulation rapture, and be a historical premillennialist. The difference being the historical premillennial position does not say that the 1,000-year period is for Israel necessarily. It's for other reasons. For example, one position in the historical premillennial viewpoint is that it will be for the confirmation that even if Jesus is reigning on this earth, people will still reject him and fight against him. And it's not really about Israel, because the church is the spiritual designation as a people of God. And so you lose that connection. And the historical premillennial position is actually where I land. That is my position for a variety of reasons. But I think that there will be a literal 1,000 years. And the reason I think that is because in Revelation 20, it says a couple things are going to be happening during that 1,000-year period. And one of them is that Satan will be bound and thrown into an abyss. Another is that there is a sequence of resurrections. And I look at the world today, and I think those haven't happened yet. They must happen in the future. And so to that end, I hold that the sequence of the end of the age, the end of all things, when it starts, will include this 1,000-year period where Christ will reign on this earth, at the end of which Satan will be released, make war on God, and that will be the final battle at the time after which all of the judgment is finally done, and even death itself is thrown in the lake of fire, and we will reside on the new earth as resurrected beings forever. So that is my position to that end. And again, I could be wrong. But I don't see the connection that dispensationalists see between the church and Israel the same way. And again, that's maybe a conversation for a different time, but the bulk of it for me is the book of Romans. A lot of what Jesus taught, this idea of Israel as a spiritual designation, not a racial designation. And if it was racial or bloodline, why isn't Ishmael saved? And so in Romans, it talks greatly about not all who think they're children of Abraham are true children of Abraham, because they're not children of Abraham by faith. And so the thought that there will be some end time thing where God will go back to racial or bloodline Israel, in spite of everything that the New Testament teaches about it being a faith title, not a national or racial title, I struggle with that. That's, to me, where it breaks down. And also Daniel 9, as I said on Sunday. There's a third position on the end times called amillennialism, which is to say that the 1,000-year period in Revelation 20 is treated as a poetic device, just meaning a length of time. And most amillennialists would say we're in the time of the millennium in the sense of Christ has come, and until he comes again, we're in this stretch. And so they would maintain that Satan is bound in the sense that the Holy Spirit is now in people and taking up residency on this earth, and quoting passages like, we do currently reign with Christ in the heavenlies, Paul says. And so we're in that time of the millennium. And then when Jesus comes back, that's it, game over. Whether or not there'll be a 7-year build-up to tribulation prior to that, I'm sure amillennialists would disagree on that or take up different positions on that. I'm not amillennial, so I don't know for sure. But I will tell you, one of the beautiful things about the Free Church is not only would all three of those positions be welcome in our church, I think all three of those positions are represented on our staff. And so that's why I don't want to pick a fight, and I'm not trying to argue necessarily, but I just want us to know that these are the generalized positions. There used to be more prominently what's called a post-millennial view, which is the idea that during the church age, we bring about the millennium where everything, where the values of the kingdom of God take over the world, and we move to kind of a utopian society. And pretty much World War I and World War II kind of crashed post-millennialism. But it also grew dispensationalism because of all the anti-Semitism that had happened throughout a lot of the church age, and certainly in the 20th century. It made dispensationalism a very attractive and appealing end times position. So again, I have great respect for it. I understand it. I understand why people like it. I consider myself a literalist. People would say if you're not dispensational, you're not a literalist. But again, I think calling Israel a spiritual designation is a literal understanding of the book of Romans. So again, we can disagree, and that's fine. But all that to say, if you are aware of these buzzing perspectives and you have to preach Daniel 9, what do you do? And so I tried to come at it as honestly as possible, and that is to say, my hermeneutics does not allow me to build an entire systematic theology on the single hardest passage in the Bible to translate and understand, which I believe dispensationalism kind of does. And so that's not necessarily, again, I'm not trying to slam it as an idea. I'm just trying to point out, if I'm on the ordination committee and somebody's trying to explain dispensationalism or defend it, and they go to Daniel 9 to defend it, I tend to push back. Like, you need to find a different passage to build this on, because which Israel are we talking about? Because in the Bible, I can count 7 different Israels. Is it racial? Is it political? Is it what about Jewish converts? Do they count? What about the believers who are not Jewish converts? That was the big controversy in the first century. All these things you get to, and it's like, okay, excuse me. To me, you don't build a doctrine on an unclear passage. You build a doctrine on clear passages. So I wanted to make that point, and I think I've made it plenty in this series, so I don't think I'm going to make it again. But like, when do the 70 weeks start? which word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And even in Daniel's prayer, he's like, are the 70 years over? Jeremiah says the 70 years are coming to an end. I'd like them to come to an end. Are they coming to an end, God? Well, there were at least 3 deportations. So when do you start counting 70 years? And is it a one-to-one correspondence that if they came in the second deportation, that they went back in the second allowance to go back? They all kind of roughly come to 70 years from the 3 deportations to the sending back years, but not exactly. And are we sure that they were exactly categorized? Everybody who went, it's weird to count. And then again, you have the 3 different times, both with Cyrus and Artaxerxes did it twice, to go back and restore Jerusalem. So which one are you counting the 70 weeks from? I mean, again, I think it's right to study it and to know that and to make a decision, but to say this is the only way you could possibly interpret it, I don't buy that. Who's the anointed one? Are there 2 in this passage, or are there just 1? What covenant is the bad guy making with the people in week 70? When is week 70? Did it already happen after Jesus' ascension, before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? That was longer than 7 years from that stretch. I mean, that was 40 years, give or take. So any way you're counting, if you're trying to do an exact math problem, it doesn't fit. It just doesn't. You have to do your math with a sense of rounding or accommodating different perspectives. And again, there are people out there with charts who would say, Jeff, you're completely wrong. I have solved it down to the number. And then I go back again to the Millerites, who they thought they had solved the Daniel 8 number down to the number. And then they kept being like, no, we forgot to carry the 1. It's going to be this. I struggle with that. And another reason I really struggle with that is it's the one thing that Jesus told us we can't know, is the date of his return. So that's not even a matter of unclear and clear anymore. It's clear that we can't know. But everybody wants to solve the puzzle. And so did I for a long, long time. So again, I understand the desire. I understand the predilection. But I really want to teach people, and as a preacher, I get the opportunity to. I really want to teach people, open-handed, land with grace. There are certain things to be closed-handed on. Nature of Christ, nature of sin, nature of the gospel, the things that are clear everywhere in Scripture, the heart of God, the nature of God. We hold that in a closed fist because it is orthodox. Eschatology, by definition, we don't know because it hasn't happened yet. And even more by definition, we can't know certain things about it. So we have to stay open-handed about it. And so that's kind of my perspective coming in. But I will, as I said in the sermon, I'm happy to do it again here. I have done the legwork myself. I have come out with my convictions on this. I don't want you to think I'm just punting and saying, well, we can't know, so let's not bother with it. No, we need to bother with it, and we need to take it seriously. My perspective is the 70 weeks started, and I've got it here in my notes, so I'm going to hopefully get the dates right, when Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah back with the Persians' money in 458 BC to begin rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. And then Ezra was working on the temple with Zerubbabel and the prophet Haggai. And I think that that's when you start counting. And that first 7-year window was the 49 years, again, roughly, that it took to rebuild the temple and the city walls. And they did it, and they accomplished it. And it was hard. And then if you count 62 more multiples of 7, by the end of week 69, from 458 BC, you are smack in the middle of the ministry of Jesus. And the dates of that, have been studied and studied. Did he start his ministry? I mean, he wasn't born in 1 AD. We know that. The dates that we put later on, that the popes put later on when to separate before Christ and in the year of our Lord, they missed by a couple years. So Jesus was probably born about 3 BC, 3 to 5 BC, based on when Herod the Great was in charge. But that would put his death roughly 30. So his ministry probably started in 26, 27 time frame. Anyway, again, we're massaging some numbers, but if you take from Artaxerxes' declaration, you get smack in the ministry of Jesus is that ministry of the Anointed One in the 69th week. And he did everything that it says in Daniel 9, those 6 things that are listed that must happen during these 70 years. The end to sin, the finish the transgression, atone for iniquity, bring in righteousness for people, and then anoint the holy holy. Some people take that and say, well, that means there has to be a rebuilt temple, and then there has to be another type of Antiochus IV to come in and desecrate that temple. And until that happens, we're not in the end times yet. And that's very much a principle of dispensationalism, that somehow Israel as a nation is going to grow in power again and rebuild a third temple because we need that for the end times to happen. And as a historical premillennialist, I say, I don't think we need a third temple for these things to still happen. Because I think the abomination that caused desolation from Daniel 9 happened in the year 70 AD, which to me makes sense as a 70th week, that the anointed one, who is Jesus, disappeared. And he warned his disciples, in your lifetime, you're going to see somebody fulfill Daniel 9 and bring an abomination that caused desolation and destroy this temple. And that did happen in 70 AD. And it's hinted at in Daniel 9, putting an end to the sacrifice and things like that. So I think the 70th week was then. Could the 70th week also be in the future with a tribulation and a very, very bad person who raises up and makes war against the saints? I'm totally okay with that still being in our future again. But I don't lose sleep over it, because I think it was fulfilled in the first century. I think that 70 weeks was about Jesus. But if it's also about his second coming, I'm totally okay with that. So that's where I come down on this passage. And I wanted to kind of detail it maybe a little more explicitly. The one thing, though, I want to make exceptionally clear, even as we're talking about all this dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, rapture, antichrist, all that fun stuff. Daniel 9, the 77s section, is contextually an answer to Daniel's prayer. And if you interpret it any other way, you're pulling it out of its context. You have to start with, what is Daniel praying about? What is he praying for? And what he's praying for is, our 70 years are up. When are you going to punish Babylon? Because that's what it's saying in Jeremiah 25, which Daniel says he's reading. So in the context, the question is, God, are you done punishing us, which we deserved, and are you going to start punishing Babylon now? To which Gabriel says, this is way bigger than you think, Daniel. And what God's really going to do is punish sin and bring in righteousness for the whole world. And if that isn't about the gospel, then I don't know what is. So is it about the end times too? Probably, maybe. I'm totally okay with that. But don't jump there without spending a lot of time in how Jesus fulfilled this first. And that, I guess, is my main point with Daniel 9. So somebody who's watching this later, or who didn't hear the sermon because you just saw Daniel 9 on a YouTube thumbnail, thanks for coming and listening, but I would recommend checking out the whole series we've been doing in Daniel, so that you're getting my comments here in context, because what we're really trying to do is make sure that we're interpreting what Daniel wrote in context, both historically and textually. And the 77s are a response to Daniel's prayer, and the answer to Daniel's prayer is, God is going to solve all evil through the gospel. And he has. But you say, but it isn't over yet. Well, Jesus said it was finished. But the truth is, there is still more to come when he returns. And if it's about that too, great. Let's all join hands and be happy about that. This week, Daniel 10. Boy, we're really not done poking at weird things. Daniel 10, we're going to talk about angels, demons, spiritual warfare in the heavenlies. And we're going to meet Michael, who apologizes to Daniel for being late because he was wrestling with the Prince of Persia. And if you want to know more about that, you got to come on Sunday. And what in the world does that mean? And how does that shape how we think about spiritual warfare and angels and demons, etc., and world kingdoms and cities of power and stuff like that? So hopefully you'll join us for that, and it'll be fun. If you are a dispensationalist, you're awesome. And if you are a historical premillennialist, you're awesome. And if you are an amillennialist, you are awesome. And you are all welcome in our church as long as you play nice about this stuff. And even if you come and you don't play nice about this, we'll have a talk, and then you'll still be welcome. And if you're watching this now, I didn't get a lot of comments. Jacob said hi. Hi, Jacob. But if you are watching this now, thank you for taking the time to watch this on a Tuesday, for taking a half hour out of your life to do this. I'm honored, and you are awesome. And for those of you who watch this later, I am speaking into the future to you about how awesome you are. And if you never watch this, I hope somebody tells you how awesome you are, because you are made in the image of God. And I hope somebody tells you the gospel so that you can be saved and join me in the resurrection on the new earth forever, because I plan to be there when and however it happens. So thanks. Have a wonderful Tuesday. See you next time.